Okay, so look, good morning, everybody. My name's Lachlan Kalish. I'm the Learning Innovation Lead from the Division of Learning and Teaching, and I'm seconded to the Brightspace project rollout for the duration. And so effectively most of the professional learning has my involvement in it somewhere or other. Today's session that we're running is the Create session, which I'll provide a little bit more context on shortly. But effectively what we're looking at is the building of learning materials and assessment in the Brightspace master site, particularly for people that are working from scratch, effectively, rather than dealing with a migrated subject site that's been brought across, the content being brought across by the migration team from Interact 2 into Brightspace. What I encourage you to do in this session in terms of questions, feedback, etc., is I've got a Q&A going. If you wanted to put questions in there, you're more than welcome to do so. That'll make sure that it's kind of front and center for me in responding to the questions, but you're also welcome to use the chat. And I will, by necessity, be needing to stop periodically for a breath of fresh air, grab a drink, etc., and a chance for you to provide questions, comments, feedback, and other things, which I'll do. I've got a slide deck on screen that you would be seeing at the moment, but effectively, I don't spend a lot of time reading from slide decks as such. They're more signposts. I spend most of the time in the sessions within the system itself, and Create, that's particularly the case because it's mostly quite a free-form session where we look at the tool sets themselves. So I've given you the slides for today, and where there's specific information or extra information about any of the bits that I'm talking about, I'll let you know which slide that sits on, etc., if you're playing along at home, so to speak. So look, I will begin with an acknowledgement of country. And I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Biripi peoples of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which Charles Sturt's campuses are located, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. And I'm coming to you from what looks to be a lovely, sunny, if cold day on Wiradjuri country in the shadow of Walu, and no one's flooding, not this morning. So that's where I am. I'll give you a little bit of context briefly before we start getting into the actual system itself. Firstly, the Create session, in terms of the continuum, I will turn that lovely doorbell off, is effectively when we're talking about the Brightspace master subject sites. The sessions create and adapt, focus on developing content inside the master subject, as opposed to the Engage and Prepare series, which happen and that target all staff really that are going to be working in our business as usual teaching sites, otherwise referred to as a session subject site or the shortened form subject site. So our work today, when we're working on building new subject material inside a master subject site, sits here. All of the work that goes into how Brightspace subjects are set up, particularly by the migration team, is informed by the LMS design principles, and the link to that is on slide 4. And the reason that we provide that, and particularly the link there, is that if you go to that page, it will provide you with granular detail on what might seem quite obvious to you. So when we talk about the first principle being that subject sites are welcoming, for example, and you might say, yeah, I'm absolutely trying to make sure that mine are welcoming in some way. There are some potential areas that you may want to consider in terms of how you might accomplish each of those principles. So that's just for your reference. And again, you might come back to me and saying, I've been doing that for decades with the way I set up my subject sites, and that's great. But the information is there for you for reference if you're looking for it. Next up, there is a growing bank of support resources in and around Brightspace, specifically at Charles Sturt. And on slide 5, there is a link to 2 of those locations. I'll show you the one where the knowledge articles for Brightspace are being collated, which is this link over here on the right-hand side. And that help page basically has a collection of resources organized underneath these different headings. And what you'll find when you get into each of those areas, you will find that there are knowledge articles where they actually break down each of the processes, and usually at the bottom This is not a good example. I'll find you one that is. They'll have the actual workflows for how to do that. So if I was to look at set up my grades, you'll find in here that there are areas where they will walk through the actual process themselves. So that site is being populated continually. So the bank of knowledge articles that are going into it is sort of growing daily. But I encourage you to access that as well. And then lastly, I do give a shout out to the Brightspace community page. The Brightspace online community, if nothing else, on its front page has a wonderful searchable forum function. And if you're looking for more information about a specific aspect within the Brightspace tool and you're just looking for a quick answer with potentially lots of different knowledge articles around that, done by educators around the world that are using this same system, you can simply start typing it in here and you will find that it's going to open up a very large collection of knowledge articles, etc., around using those particular tools. So I encourage you to use that as kind of a quick reference if you can't find the answers you're looking for elsewhere. Okay, what do we try and do in the create session? We really want you to get familiar with the idea of how we can organize learning materials and the tools we use to create them inside Brightspace. We're going to look in more detail at the Brightspace WYSIWYG, which stands for what you see is what you get. All that means is the editor that we use inside Brightspace itself. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about sequence of learning, if that's a consideration. Quite often we have academics building subject sites from scratch that are interested in suggestions about maybe how to organize learning objects inside their subject site. And that usually branches across into the idea of talking about learning sequences. And really, certainly the second half of the session today, we're going to be spending more time looking at assessment shells and rubrics, which is an important part of setting up the master subject sites so that they're ready. And I will unpack that more in due course. The agenda itself is just ways for me to organize some of the slides. We won't worry too much around that, but the first part is we get a bit familiar with the interface and understanding what we're coming from Interact 2 into Brightspace and where there's like and other cases where we've got a completely new way of doing things. Then we get into working with the creation tool set, and then we get into the assessment shells, etc. I'll stop there for a moment and see if anyone has any questions at that point before I continue, or are we good to keep going? Okay. Thank you very much. All right, there is a slide for terminology on slide 10 in the deck today, which you may be experiencing a bunch of new terms within Brightspace. If you do hear new terms that you're not familiar with in this session, you can either put them into the chat and I'm happy to explain them there. But also if it occurs to you later on and you would like some explanation around them, there's a link to a Menti word cloud down the bottom there that you can add the new terms to, and we'll get them incorporated into the terminology that we talk about today. Because it's a new system with new tools, new interfaces, etc., then we do come across new language. So where that happens and you're feeling a bit uncomfortable with it, by all means, add them in. All right, I'm going to get the slide deck off the screen and start walking through the system, but where I'm kind of starting in the deck is about slide 11 for your reference. Just get slightly organized. Okay, I'll start off with just a little bit of context with the Brightspace interface when we're getting familiar with where things are located. So I'm going to the base address, learn.csu.edu.au. It brings us into the Brightspace homepage. One of the big differences that we have in this system is that we have a system homepage versus a subject homepage. The Brightspace homepage, which is our system homepage, sometimes also referred to as the personal homepage. So if you're seeing documentation talking about any of those three things, a personal homepage, system homepage, Brightspace homepage, it's the same thing. It's this first screen when we go into the system. What we see on that page in terms of our navigation is a black menu up the top, which is called the nav, system navigation. It's only got a few options up the top. On the system homepage, when we jump into our individual subjects, there are more options in there that are subject specific. Underneath the banner for CSU, we have the My Subjects widget, and a widget is simply a tool which will point you towards other functions in the system. In the case of the My Subjects widget, it is a tool that we can use to find the subjects that we have access to, that we're enrolled in. It'll be the same for the student view, subjects that they're enrolled in. There are some filters at the top that will allow you to narrow the list of subjects there. The one I have selected at the moment is only subjects that are being taught in session 1, 2024, so what we would call 2024-30. There are other types of sites in the My Subjects widget that we can filter by, an example being under the support tab, things like the academic integrity modules, etc. Will be located in there. Also, org sites that people would enroll in might be found underneath that. Sandboxes, for example, if you're doing development work in Brightspace, you can use those filters to narrow the list, or you can display all subjects. There is also an option at the start called pinned, and what that means is that if you've used the option here to pin a particular subject to the top, choosing pinned is only going to show those ones. So you can make this as small a view as you like. Otherwise, like myself, you may have a very, very long scroll going on of subjects if you have access to multiple. The other way that we can find our subjects in Brightspace, and personally the one that I use more than any other, is up here in what's called the mini bar. These icons that appear above the nav is called the mini bar. I'll focus, zoom in here. This one here with the squares is called the waffle, I'm guessing because of the squares sitting next to each other looking like a waffle. And it is a subject selector. And what that means within that is it's searchable. We can start typing the name of the subject and it will narrow the list. If you know the subject code itself, even better. And then it will narrow that search for you. The ones that you've been using most recently will appear towards the top. You can pin the subjects so that they appear at the top of the list always again, so that's helpful. You also have the option to go into a more advanced search if you need to. But usually this is enough for me. Either I'm finding them pinned at the top of my list or I can search specifically by the subject name. This is a good opportunity to point out, I talked about us working in master subject sites. A master site has no students enrolled into it. It only has a small selection of staff enrolled into it. And we tell the master site by the M dash before the start of the subject code and the lack of any suffix here at the end that points at a particular teaching session. So the distinction here with Med 111, this is the master site. This is the session site that's being used for teaching in 31, in this 31 session. So this particular teaching site will not appear until 4 weeks before the teaching session is about to commence. So we do all of our development work, preparing the master, etc., in the M dash site here at the top. And then 4 weeks prior to the teaching session, as long as the subject's listed in the SAL as being the subject availability list as being run in 31, the snapshot will be created and this new subject site will come into being using all of the information that is current in the master. Does that make sense? That's how the provisioning happens 4 weeks before. So when you're working on your master site, adjusting your content, keep in mind that any changes that you make after that 4-week cutoff before the teaching site happens will not be updated into this new site. So you have to keep that cutover in mind. They'll only be available the next time that it's provisioned, the following teaching session, etc. So sometimes you've got to keep that timeline in mind. The new site, with all of the content that it pulls from the master, happens once, 4 weeks before the teaching session commences. If you've continued to make changes in the master after that point, they're not going to be reflected in that site unless you manually go in and make those changes. It's just important to keep that cutover in mind. The next time that it's run, let's say that 60 and then in 90 or 30 in the following session, yeah, the new information will be there. But once the session site is provisioned, it no longer pulls any new information from the master. It's just use them. Can you still add the new changes? Yeah, you can absolutely add the new changes, whether you're manually updating your session subject site or if you end up exporting content from the master, and I can show you how to do that today. That was a question that we had in the Q&A. Good question. All right, so that's our nav. A number of other tools, which we don't really look at that much in the Create session itself, will appear on both your system and your subject home pages. They appear kind of on the right-hand side. Some of them are communications tools like the announcement tool. Staff links tool underneath might be of value to you, particularly if you're looking at trying to find things like the subject experience survey or your quasar reports. Access, if you're needing to have yourself added in to subject sites, that's usually school admin, etc. Utilize those systems. The subject delivery guide, for those of you that utilize that for hints on what to do in the weeks leading into the teaching session, etc. Those links were available to us in Interact 2. They're available to us here as well. What you may find of interest is the subject outline tool link that's at the top here of the Brightspace homepage. This will open the actual tool itself if you have access to it, if you're involved in the QA process, etc., leading into a new outline being published. But once we actually get into our teaching sites, which is where students will access published subject outline tools, they find those underneath the My Subject option here. The subject outline is the very first option that appears there. That will only be visible and available in a new session subject site, not the master site, because there's no outline published at that point. Okay. Just bring back my slide deck to make sure I'm not getting too off track. The other thing that we see both on the Brightspace homepage and our subject homepages is the mini bar. As I mentioned up the top, we have the waffle. There's also an email tool, which is subject specific. This tool will allow you to basically send communications out to the cohort, but you can also refine it either to individual students, groups. If you've set up groups, marking teams, student groups, other groups, you can use the email tool for that function. And this is a dynamic email tool. What that means is that if you send out comms from that tool, it will respond back into your Outlook inbox, your work email address. It doesn't come back into Brightspace somewhere. So you can send them from here, but it recognizes who you are and your work email address, and responses will come back into your Outlook email box. The other important thing that you may want to spend time looking at is your profile image up here in the top right-hand corner. I'll talk about why that's important in a minute, but first up, it's important that you understand that you will be changing the role that you have in this system backwards and forwards when you use this tool so that you can see what the student view of the content looks like. Mostly you'll be coming in either as a subject convener, for example, coordinator, and looking at the content view from the instructor view. But to see how that content changes and looks to students, you'll need to switch your role in here through the profile tool across to student view. And once you do that, you'll see underneath your name, it's got Lachlan as student, for example, until I change it back. So if at some point you're wondering why it doesn't look the way that it should for you and why you can't see your folders where your content are, make sure you're just glancing up there to have a look at your role. You may need to pop out of the current role that you're in and go back to your instructor view. All right. Moving right along, I will take a moment. On slide 14, we talk a little bit about the difference between a master site and a subject site. The master site is a persistent site that sits in there. It's where we curate our content. It only has limited access. There's never any students in there, which means you're not going to get any learning analytics out of it or data around how the site and the content is being used. All of that happens over in your teaching site that's provisioned for each teaching session. The master site allows you to see all of the content, whether or not it's hidden to students or not. It means that we can see all of the assessments for all of the cohorts that you set up when we create our shells. There's not a grade book because there's no users. So we set up the shells and things, but we're not going to be dealing with a grade book as such, and we don't get any reporting data. And as I mentioned before, the distinction we have between the session and the master is that M- and no session code afterwards. In terms of what's happening for those subjects that are being migrated, the migration team will take all of the content from Interact 2 and bring it across. Some of it will be culled and removed once it's been migrated across. What I'm going to show you today with Create is in the instance that you want to get some of your old content from Interact 2, what you might need to consider if you're doing that yourself. But when subject migrated over, that whole process is handled by the migration team. What that team is doing, and something you may want to consider, is that they are re-establishing folder and item structure in the system. If that's something that you're looking at as well in your old Interact 2 sites and how you might replicate that, we look at how to deal with that in terms of styles and elements, etc. Another one is any new interactive elements or videos like Panopto videos. We're going to look through that process, how to do it. And also we need to remove theming elements that we had in Interact 2. What I'm getting at, and I'm sure you're familiar with this from Interact 2, is the amount of style and theme and headings and fonts and kind of containers that we sat different objects in. We have over a decade of built up kind of changes to the theme that was in place in Interact 2. None of that exists in Brightspace. We don't use it anymore. We have a much simpler, cleaner interface, and we're not going to be bringing that stuff across from Interact 2. We have to strip it out. So I'm going to show you what that involves. Quite often people will have in their content links or references to things that live in Interact 2. That means as part of your process of getting the new content in, that we don't have those anymore. We're not going to have links that point back to things in Blackboard. We're not going to have content that says, make sure you check your whatever it's called, which was something in Interact 2. So we have to obviously keep that in mind when you're perusing your content. All right, to help with this process, we have a document called the Migration Equivalence Table. I'm going to put it in the chat for you. And it's to help understand the old versus the new effectively. I'll put it in the chat there. And I will open that same document myself. I'm not going to go through each of the terms in here, but just to give you an example, the migration equivalence table, if I can make that a little bit bigger, I think we can safely get rid of that. We'll look at all of the items that previously sat in your nav in I2 down the left-hand side and what's happened to them now, what they look like now. So for example, our home pages, which was sometimes called welcome in Interact 2, have changed a little bit. That content that's been brought across from the nav needs to now be put into a folder in Brightspace called welcome. That folder in Create, you'll need to make yourself. I'll show you how to make the folder. It's very easy, but it needs to be called welcome, the very first folder. Where we had a getting started folder in Interact 2, that content will not have be brought across by the migration team. So if you're thinking of bringing it across, keep in mind that a lot of it is to stuff that was happening inside I2. But if any of it has value to you, like an orientation to the subject, etc., you could put that potentially within your welcome folder. Other examples include things like the subject outline tool. We have that as part of our nav now, so we don't have a folder specifically for that or a link to it. Yeah, so work through each of these different areas if you're confused about what happens with a particular tool. There is an equivalence here that you can look at to guide whether or not those things need to be in your new subject site. Another example, EASE. We don't have an area for EASE because we don't use EASE anymore, things like that. So it's worth having a look at the migration equivalence table. if you're confused about what you do about particular objects that you used to have inside Interact 2 but don't anymore. All right. Let's have a look in system at and talk a little bit about learning material structure in Brightspace. So for that, I'm going to go into a subject site, a session subject site that already has some content areas in it. I'm looking at this from the instructor view inside the subject, and the ways that I can view my content is either by using this My Topics widget, which the students also see. It gives you a thumbnail view. It gives you some progression indicators of how much of the content has been viewed. They use the term completed here. It just means that they've gone to the content. But that's an indicator for the individual user, the student, for example. So Lachlan, the student, has looked at one of the two different pieces of content that sit in this folder, and 2 out of 20 for this folder, etc. This is more just so you get an understanding of what it looks like for the students. For me, working within it as an instructor, I'm going to go up here to the content menu to open my files and folders view, which is really our bread and butter for building in Brightspace. Left-hand side, folders. Right-hand side, we get a preview of what it looks like. You'll see the word topic up here in Brightspace that's referring to the top level folder. Don't be thrown by the term, it just means the top level folder. Each of those folders, either content within it, individual items, or I can also make subfolders. Over here on the right-hand side, create new folder. So we only really want to work in Brightspace with 2 layers of folders, top layer and 1 layer of subfolders. Don't make any more subfolders within subfolders because they're not viewable on mobile devices. There's an issue with how they come across. So if you're wanting to organize your content, keep that in mind first and foremost. We can work at two layers, really. So you can see I've got a whole list of items in here. They're using the terms weeks to label their top level folders. You can call them whatever you want. Topic, unit, module, it doesn't matter. That's whatever you've been using beforehand. Block is another term that's used sometimes to refer to content organization. It's just the top layer of folders that appear in the navigation for students, which is the same as these individual tiles that we're seeing here. Same thing, top layer of folders. So if you decide that you only really need 1 layer of folders with items within like this, fine. If you instead want subfolders within those top layers as well for different reasons, you can create new folder. And all that is a subfolder. Keep in mind, if you're looking at this description area underneath your folder level, only a limited amount of that text is displayed to the students in those thumbnail views. So avoid putting in essays worth of content in the folder description. If anything, it should really just be quite a brief, blurb as such, or summary of what's going to be contained within it, because it's not going to be visible immediately, and certainly when they're looking at that on mobile devices, etc., it's quite condensed. Every item in Brightspace that you can create has the potential to have availability dates and conditions added to that item. I'm showing you this here. It's the same for all of your content items. And at the same time, I'm saying to you, in your master site, you should never add start and end dates to things, because those are going to be session specific. If you decide to put start and end dates, which just means when the content becomes visible or hidden to students, you would be doing that within your individual session subject sites. So if in 30, I want to have a release date and time, don't put them within the master folder. So I've showed it to you, and at the same time, I'm saying don't ever put any information in your availability dates and conditions in the master. Okay. All right, I've created a subfolder here. Now I'll point you down towards the interface at the bottom here. I can either save and keep working on it. They don't auto-save. I can save and close it to be returned to my files and folders option, which I'm going to do in a second. But I want to point out to you that all new content in Brightspace is hidden by default. So there's a toggle for that visibility for the content that you can toggle here. You'll also find other toggles for the visibility of content all over the place. So I'm going to save and close. Here's my subfolder in here. It's sitting at the bottom because it's the most recent thing that I added. But if I hover my mouse here, I get these handlebars and I can rearrange where it sits. If I so desire, I can rearrange any of the items that sit within here underneath. If I want to drag them so that they sit within the subfolder, I can do that as well. The nav allows you to just reorder your content items however you want. And there's that prompt here that tells me that these items have been hidden. The folder, these items, if you have any content that's within a folder that is hidden, the items within will also be hidden. Even if you don't see the visibility icon here, if they're sitting in a folder that's hidden, it stops the students from seeing anything within the folder. I can also toggle that visibility immediately up here. So there's, I guess, our first consideration is that the first folder that you have within your site has to be called Welcome. The reason for that is because there is a feature within Brightspace called the Welcome widget. The Welcome widget will pull whatever content you have in this folder and immediately put it in front of all new users to the subject. They have to look at it first before they can even start looking at the rest of the subject site. It's turned off currently. It'll be turned back on in 60. I'll give you a look at what the Welcome widget looks like. I go into QA and find any subject site, that'll do. It sits down here where it says Welcome window. This is what it looks like to students or new users to the subject site, including staff. It will pull the content items from your Welcome folder and make them scroll through that content before they are then able, if there's multiple, they have to go to next, before they're then able to dismiss the Welcome widget and never see it again. Maybe you think it's a gimmick, maybe you think it has value, but effectively, they're going to have to work through whatever's in your Welcome folder before they can start going into other area content in the subject site. So just to understand maybe what you're putting into the Welcome folder. And there is a slide on slide 20 in the deck, which gives you some ideas around maybe what to put in there if you're not sure. Might be obvious to you. Some people put in information about the teaching team, orientations to the subject, others record videos. Think of all the things you had on your Interact 2 homepages. They were very varied, obviously diverse. Some people put quotes in there, some put videos in there, other people had pictures of people, contact details. You don't necessarily have to put all that information into your Welcome folder, particularly the contact information, because it's going to be captured within another widget called the Profile tool. I'm not sure if you've heard about it, but effectively it will pull information about the convener, the coordinators for the subject, and make them available on the homepage to the students. Right, the staff profile widget, I'm not sure if I can see it here. Okay, there it is. We'll see if it loads. I'm in the QA environment at the moment because these features have not been turned on in production just yet. Maybe I'll find a different subject for you. Let's try that one. There we go. So there's just an example. It'll pull that information automatically from the system in the session sites and identify the convener and the subject coordinators. I think they're still identifying even the markers in this tool, and it'll have information from the profile of the person that will include which campus, building, phone, if there's phone information in there, probably the most important, apart from a picture, obviously, is where you have a consultation procedure in mind, or when you're going to be available, or how you're going to be available, etc. Any of that information will be pulled into that profile widget on the front page automatically. What that means for you in building is that you don't necessarily have to provide that information in your welcome folder. It'll be in the subject outline, I assume. It'll be pulled from here automatically. You don't have to put it into your welcome. Okay, I have a question from Marie-Louise. Can students go back to the welcome after they've dismissed it? Absolutely. It's the first folder in their content. They can always go back to it if they want to. It's a great question. I will hit done. All right, getting back to our content building and moving beyond the welcome widget. All right. So a few broad considerations, and you might think these are fairly obvious. How many of these do we need? Well, to start with, if we've got 14 weeks in a teaching session, maybe you're starting with 14 weeks for your folders that you're setting up, and then setting up your content within each of those weeks. Are you just duplicating what was in Interact 2, for example, or are you trying a new structure? Something to keep in mind. I usually get asked, how many should I create? I was like, well, those units that you create probably need to be based upon that unit of currency for students, which is usually time. So weeks in the session. Some programs, nursing's a good example, organize their content into much bigger structures, like blocks, for example. But as long as you keep in mind 2 layers of folders to begin with, guiding how you're going to organize the information, this is probably a good opportunity for me to show you a nursing subject so that you can see what I mean when I'm talking about the layering of subfolders. Have I got some examples in here? Let's try some of these. That'll do. Let's go with that one. Their content. If there's some in here, there's no content. Fantastic. Let's try a different one. $533. We'll give that one a go. Okay, this looks like it's just been migrated, but they've only got 1 layer of content in here. Quite often you'll find there are subfolders in there where they're talking about case studies or particular sub-blocks within it, but they definitely utilize 2 layers of folders rather than just the one. Not a great example for me to show you. Anyway, I'll move on. All right. One thing we need to think about in Brightspace is informed by what the students see in terms of their content. And that's to do with how much content do we put on our individual pages and items. How much scrolling is what I'm getting at. There is certainly an argument out there that you want the information that's appearing within each page to be limited in terms of how much scrolling happens. So either a screen's worth or a screen and a half, for example, but try and avoid multiple screens worth of scrolling, because what Brightspace does is it organizes the content items so that the students click through page after page after page. You may have seen this before elsewhere, but in case you haven't seen it, I'm going to switch to the student view. Go into some of my content. When the students launch their content, they've got an option to open from these thumbnails, or the student view, when they click on content, opens up this tool, which allows them to launch each of the folders. Launch topic will launch from the last content item that you finished. So it's progressive in that sense. But if I open up one of these folders and it shows me, see, they've got subfolders in here, collapsible, with multiple content items in it. So this is 2 layers of folders that we're looking at, what it looks like to students. And then if they launch the lesson, it'll open the first one. This is a folder. And you can see all it has is the heading at the moment, no description underneath. Up here on the left-hand side, for the student view, they have a thing called the hamburger menu. Probably called that because of the 3 lines, I guess. But this allows them to jump between content items. We've tried to get this turned on by default because it's pretty valuable to be able to jump between content if you want it, but it's not at the moment. They have to manually select it, and then that will allow them to jump between content items. The other way they move between their content is to use these arrows in the top right-hand corner. Right, moving between page after page after page. All right, so there's one item. You can see that they're able to print or download each of the pages within the content. And then this is now moving through. This is probably not the best example. This is the learning resources folder. That's probably why. So they're all web pages. That icon we can see on the left here is a link out to external web page resources. If we have a look at some of these learning activities that they've got in here, you can see that what they've embedded there is PDF files within their content. So what I'm getting at is that there is not a lot of scrolling happening between each of the content areas that they're adding in this subject. It's usually contained on either a single screen or a screen and a half or so when they add them, and then they move through to the next item and the next item and the next item. This is different from I2 where we had one long scrolling screen of multiple objects. This one is they are distinct screens. All right. There are some suggestions on slide 21 of things you might want to be considering in terms of what you might like to add into your content, but I would like to spend some time with the actual editor so we can do some building. I'll stop there for a second. Does that sound okay to everybody? Yep, okay. Thank you for those of you adding questions into the Q&A. That's great. Can I put the slide deck in again? Sorry, I just saw the chat again for the first time. I totally can. Create. There we go. All right, let's do some building. I'm going to jump out of the student view, go into my content. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new top level folder. I'll even call it that. Maybe there's a description in here. Save and close. And you'll see it's added it to the bottom of my list here. I'm going to work within this folder as long as it's highlighted here on the left-hand side. Anytime I click on either create new or add existing, which is what we're going to be working with now, it will add those items inside this folder. Otherwise, if it's not selected, it could add them anywhere in here and I'll have to start dragging and reordering. Make sure the folder that you want to build the things in is highlighted. Then start doing your building. All right. First thing I want to show you is the editor with new pages. The main unit of currency we use with content in Brightspace is the HTML document. Don't be thrown by the term. You don't have to know anything about coding. It simply means blank page. So I've gone create new HTML document. And this is where you're going to be building most of your content in Brightspace. Give a title for the page. Don't put in due dates, avoid availability dates and conditions. I'll give you that reminder again in the master site. Don't put any dates or times on things. Once we get into our actual editor window, this bar across the top here, you can open in a bigger screen if you need to. But this menu of options is called the WYSIWYG. I mentioned this before. It stands for what you see is what you get. I'm only telling you this because sometimes in support documentation, they use that term. In the WYSIWYG, find this option. All that term means, WYSIWYG, is options that are within this editing menu. You're going to see a limited number of formatting options, and that's deliberate. What you get in here is so that we can maintain the consistency of how all the subject sites look in terms of sizing. You can see that there isn't an option here to change font types. For example, it's all the one type in here. We can change the size of things based on headings, subheadings, etc. But those are limited amounts of options that sit in the top. And in fact, we have an even better way to ensure that the content looks the same. And that's contained over here in the select template option. This is only visible in the HTML file blank page building. When we go to our select template options, you'll see that there are a few possibilities here for you to use. I'm going to say the same thing that I said earlier on to Marie-Louise, and that is I only generally use the blank option, which will give me a heading that I can start populating. And that's going to give me the right size for the heading and then my content. And you can see that the option up here That's changed it automatically to heading 1 at the top. And the content, when I start populating that, it's applying that to the paragraph size. This is how we make sure that all the content keeps the same sizes, etc. And if I was going to put subheadings, etc. into my content, I would then be going down here and choosing heading 2, for example, because that's the next one down the list after we have heading 1 at the top. The next layer down is heading 2. So if you're worried about sizes of headings, etc., they're really, really simple. Heading 1 at the top, any subheadings. Whoops. I would be making as heading 2. And that then ensures font style, size, etc. is just maintained. It's really simple and straightforward. I'm not sure if you can type in Hebrew or Greek, Marie-Louise. I think I can ask the question. You'll find that there is actually the ability to change different types of fonts underneath there, but usually the first question that we have, so I can see Hebrew is an option that's listed here. Usually what we're looking for is to make sure that people are sticking to the styles that are maintained at the top there. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions to that, which you've raised one. If you've got content that's coming from somewhere else and you want to just copy and paste it in here and maintain these format types, the process is really simple. Copy it, select your template that you want to use in here. Whenever you change the template type, it's going to clear the content. So be careful that you get the steps right. If I chose activity, you'll see it's now blank. It's replaced it with what's in that template. If I change that back to blank, it's cleared it all as well. So what you want is to choose the right template and then paste in your content. If you paste in your content onto this now, it will apply this formatting. So if, for example, I went across into an Interact 2 site, just for argument's sake, if you're getting your content out of i2, doesn't matter what it is, Lachlan, anything at all, this will do. And I said, okay, there was information in week 1 and 2, and I wanted this text, for example. I'm not going to talk about videos just yet. If I wanted this text, and I copied it, not my profile, where was I? How about there? That's not it. That's not it. That's not it. Too many tabs. Sorry. Here we go. Right. I want it in here, inside the body text. And what it's taken is that image, but it has applied the paragraph formatting and text formatting from the other page. Right. So we will apply that. You may need to do some fixing up here of some of the other things like bullets and things, but effectively, it will apply the formatting style after as long as the template is in place first. So that takes care of the fonts. And then that's up to you to figure out things like your subheadings. Remember, we said if that's a subheading, then I would be going into heading 2, for example, and applying that there. Tamika.
Sorry, it's probably easier to talk about it than typing. So just a quick question. So with my i2, I have like module 1, and then I'll have, say, 4 or 5 topics in module 1. What you're saying is instead of like copying everything from that topic, which could be, you know, a scroll of 3 or 4 scrolls, and popping it in here, I should like be putting it in as a as like a secondary folder, but then say underneath, if I had an activity, then have that as another secondary folder.
Pages.
Yep.
Pages, right? Is what I'm getting at. So
yep, okay.
That's the unit that we're working in, is that each of the individual content areas are going to be pages. There are obviously creating different types of if they're interactive activity, other things, but I'm talking about text. Any kind of text that you had previously in a content area in i2 effectively needs to be its own page within that list for the students to click through. Your folders are to help you organize things, I guess, in your own head, and for the students to make sense of it in either in that top layer, if there's only a few, or if there's more that need to be organized into sub areas. So some people had learning resources as a subfolder and then had the individual pages inside that. Others have things like use cases or scenarios, or I'm not going to say readings. I'll talk about that in a second, but like a reading list or something like that, that they may potentially be using that layer of subfolders. But because you can't go more than 2 layers deep, you've got to think about, obviously, carefully about how you want that to play out. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I could have the module and then say the 4 topics as that subheading, and then in that subheading, then I could do the pages in there.
100%.
So it flows. Great.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, your best sanity check on this is obviously switching to the student view, but I'll give you a little bit of a hot tip on that. You want a second screen where you can always see what the student experience looks like without you having to continually keep going up to your profile and changing. The way to do that is you log in via a different browser. If you're doing your building work in Chrome, open Firefox or whatever other browser you want to use and log in as a student in that one. And that way you can just keep refreshing it in that other one to see what it looks like without constantly going up and changing backwards and forwards. It's easiest way to do it. The other option is, if you've got one of these, mobile device, for example, phone, tablet, whatever, get the Brightspace Pulse app onto your mobile device, and you can look at the content as a student does on the mobile device. And that way you can jump backwards and forwards. Both work, both are perfectly valid. I usually have it open in use the different browser windows, but it's because each browser is remembering your login credentials and profile information separately. They're not fighting with each other. All right, so we put in a bit of text content there. Let's unpack some of the options that we have in terms of the editor, just for your reference. There's limited options in terms of bold, italics, underline, etc. You will find that there's also alignment that you can use. The only one I'm really going to bring up here is that most of the time in this system, the content that you're putting in text-wise should be put to the left, and any video or interactives, media and other things, pictures, need to be centered. That's your 2 kind of tips in terms of how to lay the content out. You can use Justify if you like, but limited indenting options, if you're going to be using indenting, those are down the bottom here, which will push in from the left or push over from the right. Those are located here underneath the alignment. You've got some bulleting options, a few. The most important thing for me to show you in here are the following 2 areas. One of them is called Insert Stuff, and that'll allow you to insert files that are located on your computer, for example, and add them into the content collection for the subject and into the content area that you're building, your learning materials. So going into that, it'll basically prompt you and say, what do you want to upload, and add that into the content. It'll also give you the option underneath to determine where you want it to sit in the content collection. Brightspace, the content collection is called Manage Files. There's a name change, right? It's not called Content Collection, it's called Manage Files. So if I wanted to add something from my content on my computer, if I was going to find something like this amazing training deck from today, right? That's a PDF file. I've uploaded it. It's sitting there. That's the training deck, the PowerPoint file. I can also choose where I want it to sit. If I choose destination, it'll say which folder in my content collection, Manage Files, do I want this to sit within. At the moment, in the back, this is what I have sitting there. But I can also create a new folder for it at the same time, if you're wanting to be organized in terms of how your files are organized in the back end. And I can create a new folder and say this one is called LK Important Folder, for example. There it is. And I can now say that file needs to sit in there. All right, this is just a way of keeping organized as you're adding files and content into your subject site. When I upload that into my content area, I then have a choice on how I want that link to operate. Do I want it to open and replace the existing content? Do I want it to be in a new window? If I insert that, you'll see it's added in this horrible, horrible link in my text. I can change the wording on this to whatever I want. It doesn't have to look like this. If I wanted instead to call this the actual PDF and got rid of the rest, that will still work. If I hit save, let's have a look at it. If I close this window, folder's right down the bottom. Try and keep your folder at the top that you're working on, otherwise you'll do all that scrolling each time. There's the page. Clicking on that opens up the document, right? So you can change the wording. You don't have to leave that horrible full line description for it. Change the text to whatever you like. As long as the blue part is still blue, it's going to open up the document for you like that. There are multiple ways to add attachments in this tool. That was one of them. We uploaded using, I want to go back and edit this document. 3 dots here on the top right-hand side. Edit. That was one way. We used insert stuff to add a file. Insert stuff, my computer. The other way we have, for example, is if we have a file that is already in your content collection, you can use the subject offering files here, find the file, and it will do exactly the same thing. Other ways, we can add a hyperlink to an external resource down here. So let's say I was desperate to point people towards the quality publication, the Sydney Morning Herald, and then decide any external link you have to open in a new window. If you try and use current window, it'll break it. So use new window for web links, for example, and then hit insert. We now have a link to a website that will then open when the students click on it. That's a hyperlink. One way of doing it, a hyperlink via insert stuff. There are other ways, there are better ways. I'm going to show you what they are. Next option in my WYSIWYG option is called quick link. Make the quick link your best friend, because the quick link options are better than insert stuff, because they're cleaner, they look nicer, and they work without you having to worry about them. One of the things you can do with quick links is that you can point to existing other material within the subject site. So if you wanted to point people towards other content you'd already created in other folders, you could quick link to other parts of your learning materials. You can quick link to other activities like discussions going on, assignments, for example, that you'd already created. You can quick link and take the students directly to them. Right, so in Blackboard, this would have been called a course link. Quick link is the same thing, but it's got some other options. You can quick link, and that will then give you the ability as well to provide your hyperlinks in text. So this is a quick link via, sorry, that's the wrong one, hyperlink via quick link. All right, the quick link function also has other things in here like interactives within Brightspace, like the checklist tool, which I will show you in just a moment. Checklist tools are a wonderful tool in Brightspace, which will allow you to create a checklist on the fly for students. They can mark it off to say, yep, I've done that, I've done that, I've done that. It's a self-check, but we get the analytics. So you can have a look at it and say, right, where are the students up to in terms of whatever you're going to use your checklist for? One of the most common scenarios I'm seeing at the moment is people are having them as almost a consolidation for the topic or the week or the module. Have you done this? Have you done this? Have you done this? Have you checked this or whatever? And they mark each of those off. And that's fine for the students, but we also get the analytics at the same time. So you can check in on the cohort to see who's done that, who's marked off what in the checklist. We did a hyperlink. The media library option is talking about any audio or video that has been created inside Brightspace, which will be using things like your webcam and your headset. So if you've ever recorded any of those options, they will sit inside the subject's media library. You can quick link to quizzes if you've created them. We can point to files, content files that sit within the subject again. So there are multiple ways to point to those objects. If you've created a survey within Brightspace, for example, you can quick link to it. And then these are pointing to third-party tools, which I'm not going to talk about today. But the quick link tool or insert stuff tool are your way to get external content into your learning materials. Now, I showed you a minute ago the way to put a PDF in to link to it like that. That's just text. Maybe that's not what you're going for. Maybe you want something a little bit more visual for your documents, your files, your PDFs. Best way to go about it is to use this option here, Add Existing. If you hit Add Existing, and this time round, we drag our same PDF in, it now makes the file its own page, its own content item within your folder, right? So what it'll do is, whether your Word document, your PowerPoint, Excel, whatever it is, it adds it as its own content item rather than on a page. So you need to think about whether that's what you're after. Some people have said to me, this is no good to me because I have hundreds of documents and files that I give to the students. So this would just make this a lot of clicking through and a lot of scrolling. However, if you've got a select number of them, this is obviously a lot more visually appealing and engaging than text on a page to link to open the thing up. This at least embeds the object, and it will work with Word. It works with all the Microsoft Suite files, is what I'm getting at. At that point, the student then has the option of downloading or printing directly from here if they need to, zooming, etc. They get some other options within text. They can switch the view type. It to me is a nicer view, and it shows up perfectly in mobile devices, etc. as well. So if you're adding attachments, which is what we're getting at here, this is probably a nicer way of doing it. If you're happy for it to have its own individual content item here. It's one way of doing it. The other option that you have with that is potentially to put all of your files in a folder somewhere in your learning materials like this, and then you could quick link to them from here, and that would do exactly the same thing. Does that make sense? All right, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole with the editor, but I can see we've got some questions and things, so let's get into those. Or you've got a question here. Is there a way to embed the file in the page or for it to look more visual as well? Or it's one or the other? Well, I guess what you're getting at is that previously in Blackboard, we used to be able to embed PowerPoint files, for example, within a content page. Is that what I'm getting at? So that we had a smaller thumbnail sized view or smaller sized view, but it sat within the rest of the text.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, right. The answer is not cleanly in the same way as we had within Interact 2. So you get the text view, or you could put an image in and you could hyperlink to it, but it's not a true embed as such with what you're getting at. If you get the embed code for things, you can totally embed third-party objects into your content pages, and that's a brilliant segue. I'm happy to show you that now. When we go back to our text page and edit, if I was going to use, you've got two options. You can use insert stuff and this last option, the embed code, if you've got the embed code for the object. This is getting specifically at things like Mentimeter, Padlet, H5P objects, for example. You get the embed code from them. You can embed it on the page. So that's one way of getting the object embedded within the text. H5P, for example, has an option for you to put files in there like Word documents, and it'll give you the embed code. So there's a workaround that will let you get that. I don't know if I'm speaking French here, but if you can get the embed code for the object, you can embed it into the page. And I'm happy to show you how that works, but let me just grab one example for you. Forbidden, of course I am. I'm not on campus, so it's not going to give me that. Let's get a Menti activity instead, because it's the same principle. If you can get the code, you can embed the object. So if I wanted this kind of interactive for students, for example, to be embedded within Mentimeter, I've got the option to get the embed code, which is actually showing people the results. There's the code. I'm not expecting you to remember this. Probably good that we're recording, I suppose. Enter the embed code here. That's fine. Insert. And now I'll show you what it looks like. Never trust the preview is my other tip. Always publish the thing and have a look at it, because the preview is not trustworthy. So you can see that the external object has been embedded in the content here. All right, so this is an interactive in this case, but the same principle will work within tools like H5P and Padlet, things you can embed Padlet walls, Mentimeter activities. You can embed anything with an embed code into your site by editing and using either the insert stuff embed code option down the bottom, or this little button down the bottom here of the WYSIWYG, let me zoom in a little, is called the source code button. So if you have access to it, to the embed code, here, for example, if I switched, now we're getting into code, and I don't want to kind of scare people away by looking at code and things, but you can paste the embed code directly into here as well if you're familiar with how to do that. And it'll drop it onto the page as well. Insert stuff is probably the easiest way to do it. Okay. I've got a Panopto question. I will get to that, Lisa Coates, in just a moment. Let me go back to some of the other questions. Someone had their hand raised a second ago and I didn't get to it. If you'd like to come off mute, I'm happy for you to ask your question.
So I'm Sati. So I already have put that on chat. I've moved from the US after many years of teaching there. And I have basically videos, lectures, lots of resources over there. Use Blackboard Ultra.
Yep.
Panopto as well. So I'm wondering if there's a way in which this can be migrated at all. Can I draw on them, move them here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's something we'll take offline, but basically what you get is that you need to export the subject package from Ultra and import that package into Brightspace, into your subject. And it will bring all of that content across for you to work on effectively and modify. The way that you do that in Brightspace, I'll show you where to find the import options once you've got the package. It'll be in your subject admin. And then you've got import, export, copy components as the option here. And you're importing components, which is going to ask for the package, right, for you to upload. So if you're working in Ultra, export your subject package from there, course package. I think they call it course package in Ultra rather than subject. And then you just import it here, and it will have an attempt at bringing all that content in, putting it in, creating the files, the folders, and bringing all the content across, and then you can start working on modifying. Panopto that you mentioned, and Lisa mentioned it as well, is a separate thing that I'll talk about now, because it's quite specific to CSU, how it's set up. And I'm probably going all over the place in terms of my PowerPoint deck, but copyright readings, I'll get to that in a second. All right. All right, Panopto. All video that's going to be used in your learning materials in Brightspace ongoing should be stored in Panopto or YouTube, for example, if you've got external recordings that are in YouTube. But I'm dealing with the Panopto scenario here. If it's in Panopto, it needs to be stored within a Panopto master folder. And because we're working in a new system in Brightspace, there is a new location for those called the Panopto Brightspace master folders. So what I'm getting at here is, if I show you the Panopto address, I have a slide in here about Panopto somewhere. csu.au.panopto.com is the address we're getting at. This is called the Panopto backend. It's the CSU account you'll be able to log into, which will show you all of the videos in Panopto that you have access to. And specifically inside Panopto, we're looking for master folders, and they use the same naming conventions as our subjects do in Brightspace, which means they're going to be called M-. Right, so if I was looking for Med111 videos, I would be looking for M-M111. This is the master folder for clinical sciences. And this is where the videos that I would be embedding inside this subject need to be housed. So there's a process involved when we're working in a new site where we have to get the videos out of Panopto from Blackboard and get them into our new master folder for Brightspace, and then we embed them. So if I was to find, knowing that there would be videos stored within this folder, that's where, I'm not going into the assignments folder, ignore that. I would expect the videos to be sitting in here in Panopto, and then I would be able to point to those videos for this subject. What that looks like, and this is not a deep dive into Panopto by any means. Yes, we're recording. Let's go back to my page. If I wanted to insert a Panopto video into my content and into my text that we were working on a minute ago, here's my page, edit the page. Let's say I wanted to put in a Panopto video right here. What we use is the Insert Stuff tool. You have to use the Insert Stuff tool, and you point to the Panopto Deep Link option, which is door number 2 here. And now it will allow us to browse to where that video is located. Use the options underneath the arrow to locate your folder. So in this case, it's gonna look at the folders that I have access to, but I can go down here and find where my subject is sitting within these folders. Let's say I wanted one in here. There's a video. There's Mark Nolan. That'll do. And we insert. At that point, it's going to add the CSU disclaimer on the front of the video, and it will be inserted into my text, into my object. Now, someone mentioned DLT in there. If you're unsure about getting videos into your site as you're building it, by all means, log a Sherwell, log a ticket, and get DLT assistance in getting the videos into your subject site. This is to show those of you that are kind of keen to do it yourself, the process for it. Insert stuff, Panopto Deep Link, find the video. But keep in mind what I was talking about with a master folder for Brightspace is that because we have a new system, we are moving across all of the videos from the old place they were stored for Blackboard into a new place for Brightspace. That's happening in the background. For those of you that have worked with Panopto before, that process should be relatively familiar. Insert stuff, the Panopto option, locate the video, insert it. And then it will be sitting full screen inside your text, ready to be used. Let me have a look at some of these other questions, and then I will see just how badly I've strayed off track here so far. Panopto's directly into I2 sites. If we want these migrated, how do we do this without giving DLT a headache? I think it's going to require a ticket regardless, to be honest, would be my answer to that question, because we're moving between systems. Between LMSs, and the Panopto videos have to move as well. So log a ticket, get the help, absolutely. And the sooner you do it, the better would be my advice on that one, Lisa, for sure.
Lachlan, can I just say something here? Jeanette and I were teaching a subject in 3rd session.
Yep.
And we were asked to put out, to move those over to a master site.
Yep.
Our videos to a master site, ready for 2nd session this year.
Yep.
But we were already teaching the session using the thing, and when they moved it, the students couldn't access it anymore because the links were broken. So can I say, if you're actually teaching the subject now, do not log a request until you've finished teaching, because the links will all break.
So I'll add in a little caveat to that. And that is that if you copy the videos rather than move them, then it won't impact the existing videos. So what they've done effectively at that point is they've tried to just up and move all the ones from one spot to the other, which is why the links broke.
Yes. Okay. So copy, not move.
Copy, not move.
Okay. Excellent. That's good advice.
Copy, not move. Yep. All right. I better keep moving. We had a request in there from Jane about copyright readings that should not be stored in the LMS. Okay, it's a great question. I can't go into copyright too deeply, but what I can say is, firstly, if the readings are going into Leganto, which the and that may not be the case, Jane, but firstly the Leganto reading lists for students are meant to be accessible underneath the resources tab. And the first option in there is readings and resources Leganto. If your subject has an existing reading list in Leganto already, clicking on this link should automatically make that list available for you in here and available for students. It'll bring that same information across. If, on the other hand, you don't have one already, you're going to get this screen that's going to come up, which prompts you to create a new course, meaning new entry in Leganto for that subject. There's a slide in today's deck around Leganto, which gives you the link to the library quick guide, the LibGuide, sorry, which walks you through the process of how to create those Leganto reading lists if you need to. And specifically also, you'd be encouraged to log a ticket to get assistance from the DLS staff to help with that process as well. They have faculty-facing liaisons as well in the library that can facilitate that process as well. But the long and short of it is that the readings, arguably for students, should be contained within Leganto if they're not already. Otherwise, the question around copyright as well has cropped up for other resources, not just readings. The answer for the moment for those, if they don't fit cleanly into the Leganto reading list scenario, and if I show you a subject site where they actually have one of those in place, it might make this a bit clearer. If we look at Med 111. These guys have already got a reading list in place. Resources, readings and resources, Leganto. And there's the subject's reading list, right? So the students have access to all of those from within the subject site. And the information's not stored in the LMS, it's handled by Leganto. The other option for resources protected by copyright, if you're worried about them, is to put them in DOMs, and you can link to them and let DOMs handle the copyright effectively at that point. That may not be a full answer that you were looking for, Jane, but I'm happy to talk about the rest of it offline if you need to. I think I probably need to get a wiggle on in terms so we can start talking about assessment shells as well. Let me just take a breath. If anyone wants to come off mute at that point and ask me something else while I'm getting my bearings, by all means do so. Okay, HTML pages, we looked at the editor, we talked about templates. Right, elements and practices. I have to show you this before we move on. Let's get back to my content. And this will wrap up what we're looking at in the editor. Here's my folder. Here's my page. I'm going to edit the page. Okay, we put a bunch of things into our content page so far. We had a template, we had a heading, we put a Panopto video in. We pasted in some text from somewhere else. It applied the formatting. We did some linking. All right. The other thing that we have in the editor in Brightspace, under this plus sign, we've got some options for putting in things like equations if we're using those, tables. What I want to point you towards here are these two options down the bottom, insert element and insert practice. These are options for interactives within your material. Element are interactives that don't require any data from the students. They don't have to type anything in. It just rearranges how you organize your content. So if you wanted to put in an accordion or some tabs, a click and reveal for your content, for example, or a call out box, you can play with any of those and organize your content within them, and it will situate those interactives inside your content, and the user will click on different areas and the content will arrange itself in various ways. So an element doesn't require any information from the user. It's an interactive that just rearranges your information. A practice, on the other hand, are interactive activities where the user has to do something with it, right? So true or false questions, multiple choice, multiple select, close activities, you know, rearranging of information, sorting activities. If you want to build interactives into your subject using the Brightspace tools that are there, you're encouraged to do so. Absolutely. Other people will continue to use H5P and other interactive types and embed them. We looked at embedding before briefly, and you're welcome to do that as well. The difference that we get with using the Brightspace interactive options, elements and practices, again, is that we get data, user data around who's doing what with these. When we embed external tools, like the ones I mentioned before, we don't get any user data. They're just anonymous people and it's student facing only. We get no data. All right, let's get into talking a little bit about assessment shells. We need to spend time on that and we are rapidly running out of time. So I want to get into that a little bit. I am happy after the session finishes to hang around for a bit if people have got other questions as well. So don't feel precious about that. So I'm up to about slide 37 in the deck for those of you interested to know where we're up to then. I want to take you through the process of creating assessment shells, and in Brightspace, assessments, really, the native assessment types that we're dealing with are the assignment tool, which is text-based assessment that we previously would have used either EASE or Turnitin submission portals for, and quizzes. Quizzes is the same as Test Center that we were using in Blackboard in Interact 2, same scenario. The third one, which isn't in this list, is discussions. You can do accessible discussions inside Brightspace, and I'm happy to if we get time, look at those. But our most common scenarios that we're dealing with when we create the shells, assignment shells, assessment shells, is the assignment tool. So that's what I'm going to focus on first. So I'm going to go into the assignments area. This opens up the assignments dashboard, and I'm going to create a new assignment to walk you through the process of creating those. When we make a shell, what we're doing is we're providing all of the information around the assignment that is not contextualized. So not specific to one particular teaching session with dates, not specific to in terms of how much it's weighted. And this will make more sense when I create the shell. I'm going to click on New Assignment. And now we need to put in a title. There is actually a quick guide around how to create these, which I'll give you access to as well. But effectively, when we create the assignment shell, we want to give the title enough information so this is going to be easy enough for us to work with later. So that's going to include things like, which cohort of students do I want this particular assignment to point to? Because in Brightspace, what we have to come up with at the end of this process is a shell for every assignment for every cohort of students. Okay, so it's important to consider knowing which cohorts are going to be in here. We can duplicate them. So let's just work with, let's create one of each in the first instance, and then we can duplicate them later. So in this case, what I'm going to do, where's my shell information? That's better. All right. Just as a sample of what we might want to do here, I'm going to start by identifying the cohort that I want this for. So I'm going to say Bathurst distance in this case, and I want to identify which assignment I'm talking about. So if I said this was assessment 2, I'm going to give it a title, and that'll probably do for the moment. Some people I know with their titles for their assessments, they don't really identify what text type it is for the student. And if that's the case, and it was called something else like times like these, in that case, at least I would suggest somewhere within your title, you identify what text type it is for the students. But that's the same guidance we generally provide to people with subject outlines. Try and identify somewhere within the title what the output is that's expected from the students in terms of the text type. So I've got my title here. Don't put in the weighting in your master subject site. Don't put in a due date. Leave those empty because that information will be configured within each teaching session, within your session subject site. Instructions for the assignment would be going in here, keeping in mind that you have the same editor that we had when we were building content before. So you can use insert stuff if you've got other information for your assessment, like Panopto videos or other information around guidance for the assessment. You can add those in using the insert stuff option. You can also add in, there's an option here for a video note, which would basically ask if you wanted to use your webcam and your headset to add in audio or video instruction for the task. If you wanted to do that, you could, and it would just attach it directly to the assignment instructions. Similarly, if you only want to use audio, no video, no webcam, whatever, you can do that. You can create those on the fly and it will attach it to the instructions. Underneath, we've got file uploads, which is just attachments. So if your assignment instruction needs to have templates, other files, additions, etc., you can attach them here to your shell underneath. And there's also a prompt down here for audio and video. In Brightspace, there are always multiple ways to do most functions. So let's assume that you've put in your instructions here for your assignment shell. Now we'll work through our configuration options on the right-hand side. I mentioned to you before, don't put in any start and end date information in the master site. Leave those empty. The other information that's available underneath availability dates and conditions is this special access area. And I'm just giving this for your information. Special access is how we manage extensions. So we don't deal with it when you're setting up your master site. There's no users in there. But when you attend other training, for example, like the assess sessions, when people are talking about special access, it's talking about extensions. That's how that's managed. The next area that we will configure for our assignments is whether or not this is an individual or a group assignment. Brightspace has a group assignment functionality. It's in here. Most scenarios that we deal with are probably individual student-facing assignments. Then we have a section called category. Let me zoom in a little for you. The category area really is just subheadings to help you organize your different assignments in your assignment dashboard. It's not linked to anything else. If you don't want to use any categories and you just want a list of assignments, you can do that. If you want to have subheadings within your assignment dashboard to help you organize them, they're called categories, and you can create categories. Some people have had suggestions like embedded tutor programs. Others have recreated the different cohorts so they could reorganize their assignment names underneath the intended cohorts. You can create new categories from here if you want to sit your items underneath, or you can have no categories and just create the items. That's up to you. Important, the submission type. Most of the time we're talking about a file submission where the student uploads a file and then that's their submission done, and then we grade and work on a preview of that file. But there are other options under submission type. A text submission would involve the student typing directly into Brightspace for the assessment rather than uploading a file. That has some bearing for some of the exam scenarios, but I wouldn't get you worrying about that just yet. Most of the time, it's going to be file submissions. Observations, OSCEs, and other things where the student is doing something in person, the submission type would be observed in person. Even the idea of a local submission where the students are giving you something in person, where they're not required to submit something into the system, you could choose either of these two options, and that would still allow you to grade the individual students, give them a score, give them feedback, but they just don't have to upload anything. So if you've got scenarios like that for your assessment, still use the assignment tool. Just make sure you change the submission type to one of these last two options, which will make sure that the student doesn't have to provide any files or information, for example. It's a mechanism for you to provide feedback and the grade. Does that make sense? Most of the time, though, we're talking about a file submission. Then we have to decide, are they only required to submit a single file or multiple files? We no longer have a limitation, as we did with our Turnitin submission portals, of only one file. We can submit the student can submit as many files as are required. So by default, unlimited will be selected. And if we're talking about things like Turnitin checks, it'll run the similarity check against all of the files the student submits. So unlimited files will be the default unless you have a very, very good reason why you only want them to have a single file in the submission. Moving down, we have allowable file extensions. And I would highly suggest that you change this option to annotatable files. This is so that we can mark up the student submission in the system, and it will also be checked against Turnitin. If it can be annotated, it can be checked against Turnitin. You're probably wondering what the difference is between this option down the bottom that says compatible with Turnitin. It wouldn't matter if you chose that, to be honest. It's not going to break the bank. But the option that we're referring most people to is annotatable files, which means we will be able to preview the student submission, provide annotations on it, and provide our feedback all in the same place. So choose annotatable files, again, unless you've got a really good reason not to. There are certainly some scenarios I've been given where people are submitting other types of files for different reasons, and that's fine. You can choose no restrictions and they can upload anything. But most of the time, what we're dealing with is this option, annotatable files, as are the allowable file extensions. Then you have to decide whether or not you're keeping all of the submissions the students make along the way, or only the most recent submission. For example, once the due date hits, that's the version that they've submitted, for example. Think about that carefully, I guess. If there's a very good reason why you want to see the full trail of submissions the students have put in, you would choose that option, but most people are defaulting to this one. I just want to see the version at the due date that they've submitted. There's a notification email field here. Leave it empty unless you've got I guess a death wish really for getting an email every time a student submits a single assignment. Leave that field empty. Which brings us to our last area, evaluation and feedback. This is the option where we can add our rubrics for our assignment shells. Ignore the learning objectives section. The Brightspace learning objectives tool we do not use. It's not what you think it is, basically, is the short answer. It's not integrated with any of our other systems. So leave the learning objective area empty. Make sure your annotation tools box is checked so that we can mark up our assignments. We don't anonymize marking here. We need to know whose paper it is that we're marking. And this will bring us to a section called evaluators. Evaluators, by default in Brightspace, anyone who marks a student's paper can also publish the student's paper, which means sending the feedback and the score through to the gradebook. If you want that not in place, so that only specific individuals will be able to move beyond draft marking, you would use this Edit Evaluators option. This will detect everybody in the subject site who effectively is an instructor or a convener or anything else. If you want to uncheck particular people as being able to mark from the teaching team, you would go through that process and uncheck those. But this is something really more that we would look at when we're looking at our teaching site. I just want to explain what the tool does rather than me saying go and make changes in here. Once you play with your evaluators, if you're changing those settings, you'll also see an option about publishers, which gives us the option to determine who gets the ability to publish student papers to the gradebook. This is something that school leadership and sometimes subject conveners are specifically worried about. But by default, anyone who marks a paper can publish the paper in Brightspace. We go more into that in the Engage Assess sessions, but that's just to let you know what those terms mean and what they're getting into. You could just leave them empty as part of creating your shells if that's what you like at this stage. All right, I want to get down to this last option because it's important, Turnitin integration. Any text-based assessment at CSU, in theory, is meant to go through Turnitin if there's a text-based submission. In the assignment tool particularly, that's definitely the case. But you have to set it up in your master subject site when you create your assignment shell. That involves going down here to Turnitin integration, clicking Manage Turnitin. turning on the similarity report. It's now creating at turnitin.com the class and the assignment in the background. That's now done. We want the learners to be able to see the scores themselves. And then we have to click on more options. This next screen is going to look a little bit more familiar to you because it's talking to Turnitin directly. Some of the options are grayed out because Brightspace takes carriage of those options. That's fine. Move down to the similarity report area. We need to make sure that students can resubmit, which is the second option. Students can resubmit until the due date, 3 submissions. This is our standard Turnitin option that we have. That will mean that they can effectively do drafting in the system. Upload, get a Turnitin score, resubmit over the top, get a new Turnitin score, etc. Then you have your decisions around what you're excluding or including in your similarity check, and this changes with every academic I talk to. Some exclude citations and reference lists and small sources, others include everything. So that's up to you to work through those options and decide what's being excluded from the similarity check. Standard process of where it's checking the papers against. And then down the bottom, we have our template options. So if you're giving the students a template to work with for their submission, attach the template here and it will exclude it from the similarity check in Turnitin. If you're giving them a cover sheet, if you're giving them a template or a proforma, make sure that you're attaching it to the Turnitin template area here so that it does not include it in those numbers. I've already seen some assignment areas in Brightspace already, and every assignment's over 65, 70% in Turnitin. It's an unnecessary headache. If you've got a template, attach the template to Turnitin to exclude it from the check. Jane, it's the limitation on 3 submissions refers to getting a score instantly. After they've submitted to Turnitin more than 3 times, it takes longer to get the similarity score back. So it's that's the only limitation in terms of that 3 submissions thing. Otherwise, they'll still get a score back, but it could take a little longer for the score to come back to them after they've submitted 3 times for the same assignment. Don't worry about checking this save these settings for future use box down the bottom. It doesn't work. So ignore that. We submit this, hit save, and we now have Turnitin turned on for this assignment. I'm going to hit save and close because I want to show you what this looks like. Sometimes it's easier to understand what the assignment shells look like when you can actually see them in place. So I just created Bathurst Distance Assessment 2 times like this essay, and next to it I can see this icon with the goggles, sorry, the binoculars and the paper. That's a quick check that says to me, Turnitin is configured for this assignment. If you set it up like this in the master site, it will flow across into your teaching sites and you'll never have to configure it again. Right, so you only have to do this once for each assignment. I did mention though that if you're creating one of these for each cohort, that you could duplicate the assignment. That's easy to do. Check the box next to the assignment that you want to copy. Let's say I wanted to make one for Bathurst Internal or Wagga or something. Check the box, hit the drop down, and I can now copy the assignment. At that point, it will open the editor again saying a copy of that one, and all I have to do now is change the cohort that it's for. Right, so I've just changed the name from BD to Port Macquarie Internal. The one thing that you do have to do again when you copy it though is set up Turnitin again, right, when you duplicate it. So you work through that process that we just did a second ago, so that each of the assignment shells in the master site has Turnitin set up. If I save this now, what we'll see, there's the 2 of them, but you'll notice that this one doesn't have the Turnitin icon because I didn't go through the steps of turning Turnitin on. So that little quick check that that icon is there is your indicator that it hasn't been put in place yet. Thanks, Azumi. Yep. All right. what I want to show you is what these papers look like when the students have submitted and you're going through your marking process, just so you can see what the end result is. I'm not going to spend time on the marking process, but I want to show you what a student submission looks like on the other end when we've set up our assignments properly. So let's get out of this. We'll go to a subject where they have submitted assignments. I'm going into my assessment assignments area and they don't have any assignments. Brilliant. That's a good choice. That's okay. Oh, I'm in QA. That's why. Let's try again. Assignments. Okay. So here we have an assignment dashboard in a teaching site where they have created each of their assessments. And you can see with the icons, some of them have no turn it in option set up for them. Others, like this first one, do. And I can see here, here's the due date. Turn it in is set up. That little ribbon tells me that it's connected to the gradebook, which is something we do in the session sites. And the key, in case you're wondering, shows that some students have been given extensions within that assignment. Over here on the right-hand side, I can see completed means that 41 students out of 41 have submitted the assignment. Evaluated means that 41 out of 41 assignments have been marked. And then lastly, published, which means that that information has gone through to the gradebook. If I was to open my submissions for this assignment, here we can see that our students who submitted multiple files for this assignment, some are PowerPoint, some are Word docs, they've been checked against Turnitin. There are the scores in the dashboard. We can click on those numbers and open up our Turnitin reports. And I can see, in fact, that this has been published and that the students have read the feedback as well. All of that is available within the dashboard. The actual marking process for them when we grade the papers looks like this. There's the student's paper in the preview. It's already been published, so I can't see my annotation options, but you can mark up the student paper here on the left. There's the rubric that's been attached. And they've walked through and selected each area, each criterion within the rubric and provided feedback against each of the rubric criterion. It has that option in the rubric tool as well. And then provided the grade. These are satisfactory, unsatisfactory tasks, but otherwise they would be putting in a score for the assessment here as well. And then the overall feedback. This has been published, it's gone back to the student, they've read the feedback. So this is our end destination from setting up our assignment shells in our master site. So I hope that's given you a little bit of context around that process. What I'm going to put into the chat now is the quick guides for setting up an assignment shell and setting up and the rubric tool as well. Let me just find those for you. So I've got creating assignments. I've also got creating rubrics. And these will walk you through from the beginning through to the end of the process. So you don't necessarily have to try and rewatch the recording or remember what I've told you here. Multiple choice questions. Absolutely, Ord. I'm happy to look at the quiz tool now. We'll probably wrap up with that. I also I gave you rubrics. What else can I give you? There's one here on checklists for those of you that are curious about creating checklists as well. You might as well have that if you're curious. Okay, quizzes. Just like we created an assignment shell, I'm now going to create a quiz shell. And that would involve going into quizzes and exams. And our first option, I've got a lot in here that have been labeled in different ways, but I'm going to create a new quiz to show you the difference. Same thing, provide it with a title that's specific enough that you'll be able to find it quickly later. So if that means cohort, assessment number, title. Don't worry about the grade out of section. That's going to be populated automatically by the questions that you bring in and the value attached to each of those questions. We're not doing any of this middle section here. That's all contextual information we set up in the teaching side, in the session subject side. So you leave that empty. Instructions for the quiz will go in here. I'll deal with the questions in a minute, but the configuration options are not exactly the same. And this will be familiar to you in terms of Interact 2. Availability, dates and conditions we're not touching. That's the visibility of it. Then we get into timing and display. How long's the quiz? By default, 120, if it's going to be an hour, whatever the case may be. How long for the quiz? You can also change timer settings. At the moment, by default, it's going to happen so that 60 minutes after they start the quiz, it will auto-submit. But you can click on the timing settings and change it. The quiz, in this case, the quiz would actually start on a set date and time for everybody, and that's it. So an exam would be an interesting use case for that at a set date and time. Otherwise, asynchronous when they choose to start it. Automatically submit, or do we not enforce a time limit, for example? How do we want the questions to appear? All together? One at a time? Or do you want to organize your questions into sections? Sectioning is quite interesting, particularly if you've got different types of questions within your quiz. So if it was multiple choice questions in one section and open response answers in another, separating them by section would be a really good idea. You can have 1 on each page, 5 on each page, all together. That's up to you to talk through how you want the questions displayed to the students. Shuffling is available here, but it's also available in other places. So if you haven't chosen it there, that's not critical. I've never seen anyone want to display hints and this other stuff against the questions, but those options are there. Closing that, we've got attempts and completion. How many attempts at the quiz? 1, unlimited, specific number. That's up to you to decide. And if you are choosing multiple attempts, do you want to take the highest attempt, the lowest attempt, averages? I've only ever seen people use the highest attempt really as the option here for a quiz, but there are some options in there. Category is just subheadings to reorganize your quizzes in your quiz dashboard. It's not student facing, it's not connected to anything else. Don't put in a notification email again, that's crazy talk. Right, then we get into some options around publishing. Do you want the quiz to be instantly marked and made available to the students with the result? That option is ticked by default. You may want to uncheck it. Then we've got, when it's published, do you want to show their attempt grade to them? And what do you want them to see? All the questions with the correct answers, without the correct answers, only the ones they got wrong? There are a few options in there in terms of the display, or do you want them to see nothing and just the score? Those options are there for you to choose. You can also customize and have additional views available to the students. When do you want the additional view to kick in, for example, for them? So there's not just a one size fits all. You can also configure whether or not you want the students to see certain pieces of information at another point in time with the quiz views. My advice to you would be to have a play with some of those and have a look. They can be quite interesting, but by default, it'd be one size fits all in terms of the feedback on the quiz. And we don't use the learning objectives section. Now, actual questions and quizzes, quiz types, information. This is probably the bit that you are actually interested in. Over here on the right-hand side, there's a preview option, which will take you through the quiz without you needing to close all of this so that you can actually see how it displays, how the questions work, what the students are seeing. So you can always launch it from there. The question is, do you have an existing pool of questions that you're bringing across from Interact 2, or are you creating new questions from scratch? If you're working with a question pool that you want to bring across from somewhere else, it needs to go into the actual question library, which what we can do is that you can browse the question library from here and find those questions and build them into the list. If, however, you're building new questions, you can start doing that from here. You can also create a new pool that you build questions within. I would suggest my workflow for the quiz tool is that you start with a pool and then you build questions into the pool, because pools have behaviors that you might want to use, like randomizing. If I've got a pool of 100 questions, but I only want the students to get 10 of them each time, I can then tell it to randomly pull 10 questions from the whole pool. So question pool is usually where we start. But in terms of the actual question types that you can build within the quiz tool, they're going to be familiar to you because they're the same really as what we get within Interact 2. There's a short open response, short answer. The written response option allows the students to attach a file. If you want them to upload a file response. I'm not going to get into the question of if they're uploading a text file, it's got to go through Turnitin, but that's a consideration if you're moving outside of the assignment tool for text responses from students. You can add your questions individually and then start building those questions out, determining how many points it's worth, and again, how the question appears. Most of the scenarios I've dealt with so far are people actually working with pools of questions that they've imported from somewhere else and added a few more of their own. If you're building a whole pool from scratch, okay, more power to you. But I would be doing that process before I built the quiz, if that makes sense. And the way that the best way to do that, I'm just going to save this shell. I can come back to it, and I know time's getting away from me. You'll see here in your quiz dashboard up the top, there's a question library. And this is where we would go into to start building our new questions. Build them within the question library first. When you're happy with them, then you can start attaching them to your, we call it a quiz instance or your quiz shell, where it has the specific information for one cohort of students or one quiz. Build your library first, or your pool of questions that you want to work with. And then we can pick it up from there. If you want to send me an email or whatever, I'm happy to help you with that process. But start in the library, build the question set that you want to use, and then we go back and start building our individual quizzes. Once you actually have your collection of one folder, multiple folders of questions ready to go. So for example, I've got, there's one in here that has, okay, that's got 5 questions sitting in here. Built within my question library already. If I go back now and start building a quiz where I want to use those questions as a pool, I'll show you how to do it. Let's see. Assessment, quiz. We were just working on, what was our shell called a second ago? That'll do, down here. I'll edit that quiz. Let's open it up. It has no questions yet. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new pool. Pool for assessment 3 or whatever it's going to be called. Now, what I want to do is actually say there's going to be 5, let's say I've only want 3 questions from my whole pool, and that each question is going to get 1 point. And now I have to find the questions that I want to populate the pool with, browse the question library. There's my folder we were just looking at a second ago with all of those questions. If I want to use all of them, I can check the box at the top. That'll grab every question that's in that folder. And now I'm going to take 3 from a total of 5. Each one's worth 1. And I can hit save. And now my pool with 3 questions from that pool, each worth 1 point, giving me a total of 3. And you can see up here that it's also reflected in the value of the task. Is that making sense? What I've done there? I know I'm glossing over a number of things, but the idea is you build your questions that you want in the question library first, then you create your quiz. And yeah, as I said, if you want to send me an email, etc., I'm happy to show you through that process in more detail. But the process effectively of creating the shell finishes there, where we've provided the questions, the pool information, the configuration for the quiz, how long it's going to be shown for the students, their attempt information, etc. And then we save and close. All right, now you may only have a couple in here. Some of the migrated subject sites have brought across hundreds of quiz instances from Blackboard from their subject sites. It brings them all. So there's a lot of spring cleaning, and you won't have that problem when you're working in a new subject site. You're just creating the quizzes that you want for the first time you run the subject. So there's a real kind of luxury there to work with. But yeah, start in the question library, build your questions up, and then we can start creating the quiz instances to point to the questions you want to use. All right, look, I am aware that we are at time. I feel like I have been talking for 2 hours, which is probably not too far from the truth, but I'm happy to hang around for some questions and things if people are after that now. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you at subsequent training sessions, etc. Good luck with your building, etc. And I will see you in another one. I'll stop the recording there.